Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a Community Development Exchange, a webinar series at the University of Minnesota Extension's Community Development Department. My name is Brandon Hofstad, and I'm the Community Economics Program Leader with the University of Minnesota Extension, and it is my pleasure to kick off today's webinar on Are we at an inflection point in community economic development, the fourth wave? Before we begin, I would like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Community Economic Development Program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. Today's webinar is also part of their Lunch and Learn series. A few housekeeping items before we begin. The webinar is being recorded, and the final video will be posted on our website at a later date when everything is ready to be posted on there. And the webinar also has closed captioning. You can find this if you prefer to enable that at the bottom of your screen on the ribbon at the bottom of your dialog box. Today, in order to engage with the presenter, we have two ways to do so. So first, we have the Q&A section, and again, you can find that at the bottom of your screen. Because this is a webinar event, myself and my colleague from Wisconsin, Kristen Runge, will be asking the questions that you put forward. And if there's a question that you're particularly excited about, please feel free to which will kind of push it up in the queue in terms of the questions that are asked when we get to that point. We also have an opportunity if you have comments or resources you would like to share related to today's presentation. So please use the chat function like you normally would in a meeting on Zoom. So again, use the Q&A for the questions, and then also use the comments or the chat for comments and resources that you'd like to share with everyone in the audience. So today's webinar is related to what Dr. Steve Deller, our presenter, has coined the fourth wave of community economic development. Briefly, Steve is a professor of agricultural and applied economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a community economic development specialist with Extension. His work focuses on modeling small regional economies, assessing economic changes, and identifying local economic strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities. And I'm very excited to have Steve join us today to share his work. In his presentation, Dr. Deller will explore how communities are shifting their approach to economic growth and development, balancing traditional business and job strategies with investments in people, places, and quality of life. And then following Steve's presentation, my colleague Brigid Tuck, an applied research specialist in the Community Economics Program at the University of Minnesota, will share insights on how this concept is being applied within the state of Minnesota. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Dr. Steve Deller. The floor is yours. You're muted, Steve.
There we go. Sorry about that. How many times have I been doing webinars like this and I still make rookie mistakes? I apologize about that. Thank you for the kind introduction. And what I want to share with you is kind of some way that we've been thinking about economic development within kind of the Wisconsin context and also what we're seeing across the nation. There are two kind of quotes from rural residents that kind of highlight kind of our change in thinking about how we think about economic development. Last year, we were doing a series of strategic planning, economic development strategic planning with a group of small rural Wisconsin communities. And at one of those meetings, a resident basically asked the question, why are we trying to create more jobs when we can't fill the ones that we have? And it kind of set a tone of discussion within that community that this traditional focus on jobs, 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 maybe we need to think about this a little differently. The other quote that has really kind of had a major impact on how I think about rural economic development and community economic development was from a survey that a colleague of mine, John Halstead, and I did back a number of years ago. We were interested in trying to understand how rural manufacturers, small manufacturers, less than 100 employees, how important was infrastructure to them? Things like access to highways, railroads, things like that. And the survey was Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Wisconsin. And one of the survey respondents wrote in the margin of the paper of the survey was, find an area that you want to live, then start your business. And one of the reoccurring things that we found in that study is that notions of quality of life really more important than things like access to a highway. or access to railroad services and things like that. So that's kind of set the stage for the way that I kind of think about things. So there's a number of ways that we've tried to lay out how we think about community economic development. Some work with Ron Schaefer a number of years ago, kind of rethinking community economic development. And then the two pieces, the current pieces, they're kind of laying out this fourth wave. The one paper that's kind of highlighted in the red box is kind of the paper that was just recently published in Economic Development Quarterly that kind of spurred this webinar, and that's where the title for this webinar came from. If you're interested in any of these, please just drop me an email, and I'm more than pleased to share them with you. They're kind of written to Hamilton to locate a manufacturing plant in the state of New Jersey. That's the first time we can actually see that documented. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825. I mean, it was justified on using public money on something like this, was based purely on economic development and economic growth. If we build out this transportation infrastructure, we can help farmers in the northern part of New York and get food to the markets, the consumers down in the larger cities. By 1884, the state of Pennsylvania had invested over $100 million and placed promoters on the board of directors of more than 150 corporations to try to, again, influence these corporations, these companies, to invest in the state of Pennsylvania. We have a long, rich tradition of trying to influence economic growth and development in our favor, in our community's favor, in our state's favor. But the modern thinking, kind of the modern tradition of how we go about economic development, can be traced back to the Mississippi Balancing Agriculture with Industrial Act of the Great Depression era. Mississippi was a pure agricultural state, and the Great Depression was hitting them very, very hard. And they decided that we need to do something. And the thing that we need to do is that we need to diversify our economy. And the way that we're going to do that is that we're going to build out our manufacturing base. How do we do that? Well, what can we do to convince all the manufacturers in the northern states, what is now kind of the Rust Belt, if you will, to pick up and move? Well, what they offered is that they kind of came up with this idea that we have a positive business climate. Our business climate is better than the northern states. Well, what do they mean by that? They essentially meant our labor's cheaper, our land is cheaper, we have limited regulations, and we have limited taxation. If I ask you, what do you think of when you say a positive business climate? I bet you these four characteristics pop into your head. So today we still see states and local governments thinking the way that we promote economic growth and development is by promoting cheap labor, cheap land, limited regulations, limited taxation. Indeed, this has oftentimes been referred to as the first shots fired in the new war between the states. Okay. It's still very popular today. In Wisconsin, it's the Foxconn debacle. Wisconsin never really played in this incentives game. They just didn't do it. It was too expensive. There's this philosophy that, if we offer this to one business in Wisconsin, we should offer it to all businesses in Wisconsin. That changed under the Scott Walker administration, coming out of the Great Recession. And we could spend all afternoon talking about Foxconn and what a fiasco it turned into. A classic example that is still studied today is the fight between South Carolina and Alabama to get a Mercedes-Benz plant located there. The story is that Mercedes had made the decision that they were going to go to Alabama, but Alabama kept sweetening the pot. They kept adding more to the incentives package. So Mercedes just sat back and said, sure, you want to keep giving us money? We'll keep giving, sure. At the end, the very last incentive that Alabama, they got so wrapped up in winning the game that they lost sight of kind of the consequences of the game. And one of the very last things that Alabama put on the plate was that the state of Alabama would buy 100 of the vehicles that Mercedes-Benz was making at this Alabama plant, was the SUVs, to be their state fleet vehicle or their state fleet vehicles. So now think about that. You work for a University of Alabama Extension Service, and you're going out to work with a poor rural community, and you show up in a state vehicle, and it's a brand new Mercedes-Benz. How is that? I mean, they get so wrapped up in the game they don't think about it. Um, the Amazon too, the world headquarters too. Amazon basically put out a 15-page call for bribes, saying, what are you going to give us to locate there? And it was a free for all. Tesla right now is the current game is to try to get investments from Tesla and battery plants and things like that. The current one that's a really popular fad is the film industry. Wisconsin just adopted tax incentives to try to get Hollywood film production companies to come into Wisconsin. Okay. The thing is that these are still really popular. These are some, I cut and pasted these from some of the websites of various state economic development organizations. I underlined some of the key points. Texas, the Office of the Governor, the best business climate in the nation, lowest overall tax burdens, billions of dollars in tax relief for businesses, right to work state. Right to work is basically a policy that kind of weakens labor unions. Okay, again, cheap labor. North Carolina, lowest corporate tax rates in the country, business costs amongst the lowest. There's less red tape and litigation. Litigation, that's another one. In the name of a positive business climate, we're going to make it more difficult to sue you, to sue the companies. So that's litigation reform. Okay. Florida, pro-tax business costs. You can see a pattern here, right to work, insurance tort reform, low tax environment, Tennessee, right to work, no personal income tax, low tax burden, tort reform. The last one, Idaho keeps it really short. They got one sentence: keep our costs and taxes low. Okay. This is still a policy that is driving a lot of states and how states think about economic development. The problem is that this has been researched for years, and the academics consistently find these things don't work. They really, really don't work. Businesses are making these investment decisions independent of these incentives. The logic that gets backwards is that a company's thinking of, say, expanding or locating into a particular area, and the state responds by offering incentives. Any profit maximizing company will take those incentives. They take the incentives, they make the investment. See, the incentives cost the investment to occur. Wrong. The company was probably already going to make the investment. The other problem with this is it's what economists call an asymmetric game. Imagine that you're playing high stakes poker. The person that you're playing against is holding their cards very close to the vest, but you're playing with all your cards face up. Who's going to win that game? Okay. It doesn't work. Policies that may have made sense 75 or even 50 years ago simply do not make sense today. Okay. This is the first wave of economic development. It's industrial recruitment with a primary focus on manufacturing. Big firms were the focus. What's good for General Motors is good for America. Tax incentives, essentially, we're throwing money at businesses to invest in your state. And public investment in infrastructure is a common strategy here. So industrial recruitment. Okay. Now, starting in the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, there was a series of studies that were coming out, particularly by David Birch, that found that there was strong evidence that job growth came from not large companies, not the General Motors of the world, but small companies. And more recent work by myself and my colleague Tessa Conroy and others have noted that it's not just smaller firms, but in particular, it's newer firms. This is sources of job growth for the US going from 1978 up to 2021, I think that is. And there's job growth can come from two places. One is new business formation, that's the blue line, or existing businesses. Well, existing businesses have a couple. One, they can maintain the status quo. Okay, they don't add business, they don't add jobs, they don't subtract jobs. That's one. The second is that, well, they could be adding jobs, they could be growing. Okay. Or they could be downscaling. They could be subtracting jobs. They could be losing jobs. Or fourth, they could shut down and lay everybody off. So job growth from existing business, we want to look at that net change. Now notice, and that's the orange line. Notice only 1 year, 1978, did existing businesses add more jobs than they subtracted. All of the job growth in the US is coming from new business formation, and they tend to be small businesses. I also broke this out for Minnesota and Wisconsin, and same pattern occurs. I've broken out this data. I've done metro, non-metro. I've compared Wisconsin to Illinois, to Iowa. Every way I've cut this data, you get the exact same pattern. New business formation is the engine of employment growth. Okay. So a couple of things came together in the 1980s. Recruitment proved to be exceedingly frustrating and a waste of time, energy, and limited resources. At the local level, a lot of economic development practitioners were just very, very frustrated that pursuing the first wave of economic development strategy, recruitment, just really wasn't working for them. Communities realized that they're not in a position to play the incentives game. Leave that to the state government. And the third is the realization that job growth came from new business formation, entrepreneurship, not from recruiting businesses. The shift in focus on fostering entrepreneurship and existing businesses. So what we've got now is we've gone into the second wave. We focus on small business, we focus on entrepreneurship, and we focus on businesses that are already in our community. Okay. Things like technical assistance for startups, helping that budding entrepreneur get their business up and running, incubators and accelerator programs, access to capital for small businesses. I teach a section in my class that's labeled, "It's all the banker's fault." Um, People trying to start a business, one of their biggest hurdles is getting the financing. And they generally, the banks are not in a position to do this. Okay. The business doesn't have a track record. And oftentimes the amount of money that is required doesn't make sense for banks. So the primary force comes from, and I got this from Tessa Conroy, the 3 F's: families, friends, and fools. Okay. So the biggest problem is access. How can communities help small businesses get access to some startup capital? Networking and mentoring programs. I'm going to keep coming back to this networking. If there's a secret sauce out there, it's social capital. And a key part of social capital is networking. Have you heard the phrase, it's not what you know, it's who you know? That's that networking. Business retention and expansion programs, exceedingly popular. Indeed, it was University of Minnesota Extension was kind of the incubator, if you will, for a lot of the national BR&E programs under George Morris. Place-focused efforts such as Main Street programs, okay, really targeted within a community, okay? Now, starting in the late 1990s and into the 2000s, two things started to come together. Again, our understanding of the economy continues to evolve, new ideas come out. And one of the recurring themes is that the efforts of the second wave seem disjointed and scattered and really lack strategic focus. There was a colleague at Northern Illinois University that wrote a paper, and this was the title of the paper: "Shoot anything that flies, claim anything that lands." He was writing it and referred to the first wave of recruitment, but it also applied to the second wave, is that we're just scattered, we're all over the place, and it wasn't strategic. The second thing is that the Economic Development Administration embraced Michael Porter's notion of economic clusters. Now, Michael Porter is a business economist at Harvard. And those of us that have studied this stuff for years got really frustrated because Michael Porter didn't introduce a single new idea. What he was talking about has been around for years and years and years, but it's had a major impact. Okay. Maybe it's because he's from Harvard. But EDA embraced this, and it really had a fundamental shift in how practitioners and communities thought about economic development. We starting to go into the third wave of notions of public-private partnerships and the focus on clusters. Okay, so what do we got here? Let's focus our limited resources on existing industrial clusters with an eye towards new emerging clusters. Let's be strategic. Let's find out what is really kind of the backbone of our economy, and let's focus on that. Let's be strategic. What looks like might be coming around the corner. Notions of comparative advantage really come into play here. Okay, to shoot anything that flies, claim anything that lands is not strategic. Networking is key to dynamic and vibrant clusters. There's two types of economic clusters. There's a geographic cluster where you have lots of similar businesses within the same industry that are in the same geographic area. And then you have what's referred to as a dynamic cluster. A dynamic cluster is where the businesses, they're competitors, but they work together. An example, Wisconsin just hosted its second Connecting Entrepreneurial Communities Conference up in central Wisconsin. And I had a chance to talk with the executive director of the Wisconsin Distillery Association. This is an emerging cluster in Wisconsin, is that there's this growth in small distillery companies. They make bourbon, they make spirits. And these companies are all competitors, right? If they enter a competition for the best tasting bourbon, they're competitors, but they realize that they're all in this market together and they network and they share information. They troubleshoot each other. They don't collude because that's illegal. Okay. And it's this Wisconsin Distillery Association that helps facilitate that networking. Okay, we're seeing things like that. Investment in public institutions that can support the cluster. Wisconsin, dairy. Dairy is really big, particularly the growth of the artisan cheese industry. The state of Wisconsin has been putting money into the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's called the Dairy Innovation Hub to help focus resources on fostering new ways to develop cheeses, new cheese development, new ways to run dairy. The state is investing in the Wisconsin dairy cluster. Okay. The other example is the Wisconsin Plastics Association. They realized that these are small plastics manufacturers and they formed an association. One thing that they're particularly proud of is they went to the technical schools and they partner with the technical schools to develop specific technical training that is custom to the plastics industry. Okay. The other big fundamental change is that communities, under the first wave of economic development, communities were competitors. You don't work with your competitors. But with the cluster, they're realizing that, hey, our economy is part of a larger economic system. And we need to kind of invest in that larger economic system. That means working with our neighboring communities. So these notion of kind of regional partnerships started to evolve. Okay, positive change, positive change. Okay, starting in the late 2000s through today, there's a couple of other ideas that have been fostering up in economic development. One is the realization that innovation comes from people. The driver of economic growth and development is innovation, new ideas, new products, new services, new ways of doing things, innovation. Entrepreneurship is the ability to take those innovations and bring them to market. Okay. These innovations come from people. You can think about Richard Florida's notion of the creative class. We could debate about whether Richard Florida has it right or not, but it's the idea is that innovation drives growth. Innovation comes from people. We need to start focusing on people. Okay. People vote with their feet. Quality of life matters. Okay. There's a structural labor shortages. This is the JOLTS data. And if you haven't looked at this for your particular state, I suggest that you take a look-see at it. This is for the US. And what this is looking at the number of job openings, which is the blue line, and the number of unemployed, which is the orange line. This goes back to 2011. Notice that coming out of the Great Recession, the number of job openings was significantly below the number of unemployed. People were looking for work. There was a surplus of labor. Then in about 2018 for the US, notice that the number of unemployed is below the number of job openings. We're starting to enter into a labor shortage. And then COVID happens and weird things happen. Notice coming out of COVID, notice that the number of job openings is significantly higher than the number of unemployed. Okay, that's starting for the US, it's starting to come back towards an equilibrium, if you will. But this is a labor shortage. This kind of reflects that one Wisconsin resident saying, why are we trying to create more jobs when we can't fill the ones we have? That's what this graph is showing us. Okay. Now, I did the same thing for the US, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Rather than the two of them, I took a ratio of the two. So this is the unemployed to the job opening ratio. Okay. If it's greater than 1, that means that the number of unemployed folks looking for work are greater than the number of job openings. Okay. So there's a labor surplus, if you will. If it's less than 1, that means there's a labor shortage. Wisconsin is Badger red. Minnesota, that is, what's the Gophers color? Golden. That's as close as I could get it in PowerPoint. But notice that across the board, the labor market is always a little bit tighter for both Minnesota and Wisconsin. Notice also that in about 2015, between 2015 2017, between those two lines, Wisconsin and Minnesota is pretty much in an equilibrium. The number of unemployed and the number of job openings is about 1. Okay. The US, there's still a surplus of labor. Look at coming out of 2017. We've gone into a labor shortage, a structural labor shortage. We don't have enough people to fill the jobs. Then COVID hits, then we come out of COVID. Notice that for the US, it's getting back up close to 1, but for Minnesota and Wisconsin, we still have a labor shortage. That's kind of why this whole kind of immigration policy that's coming out of the Trump administration is the timing of this within the labor market. Is this really the right time to be doing this? But that's a whole different issue. The point here is that communities started to shift their focus away from thinking about jobs, 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 to start thinking about people, 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 voting with their feet. The other idea here is that historically the data supported the idea that people follow jobs. Okay. You create employment opportunities, people will move into the community to take advantage of that. That's what the data, that's what the research tended to emphasize. So that makes sense. Focus on employment opportunities, and then the people will come along. Okay. That's starting to change. Okay. Increasingly, the data is suggesting that jobs follow people. This goes back to that kind of that rural manufacturer. Find an area where you want to live and then start your business. That's kind of what this rural manufacturer was hinting at back in the mid 1990s. Okay. Now I'm talking about this in terms of black and white. It's jobs follow people or people follow jobs. It's really shades of gray. But what's happening is that the degree of going from a light gray to a dark gray, it's shifting. And it's shifting towards more jobs are following people. So quality of life, livability is becoming the focal point of a lot of economic development efforts. So the shift is away from jobs, jobs, jobs to one of people, people, people. Is that shift occurring? That's why it's a question mark. That's why the title of the presentation is a question mark. This is what we think is happening. Okay. There's a realization that the jobs follow people has flipped. Okay. Now, if you think about the first wave, the second wave, and the third wave, that people follow jobs makes a lot of sense. You focus on jobs. But with the fourth wave, if jobs are following people, then we shift and we start focusing on people. Why would people want to live here? Why would people want to start here and maybe start their business? Tessa Conroy and I published a paper a couple of years ago looking at migration rates and entrepreneurship rates in remote rural areas. And one of the things we found 2 sweet spots for entrepreneurships and age migration. One was kind of early to mid 30s. Okay. If you got people that are early to mid 30s moving into your community, there's a sweet spot there for business startup. Also, early retirement, age 55 to 65. These are folks that are taking early retirement, they're moving into a new community, and they're starting a business. Why are they moving into that community? Okay. Planners talk about this in terms of placemaking. Placemaking might be a term that you're familiar with. And what they're doing is it's the context of it within the context of economic development. What they're referring to really is trying to create and enhancing and sustaining public places, the built environment in ways to improve quality of life. Okay. What can we do within this community to make it more physically appealing to people? Okay. They talk in terms of walkability, mixed use development. With Madison is going through a growth spurt right now, and we're seeing a lot of apartment developments going up, and they're mixed use. A lot of them are mixed use developments. The first floor is kind of traditional retail services. The second floor is kind of business oriented, maybe a gym or office space. And then the third, fourth, and up are apartment buildings or apartments. It's that mixed use. That kind of fits into placemaking. Iowa and a lot of Iowa rural communities, you've seen this occur, is that you have a downtown and you may have a vacant abandoned building downtown. What communities are doing is they're knocking the building down and they're building little pocket parks. Okay. Inviting public spaces. Okay. The challenge that we're looking at is that our interest in rural communities, smaller communities, is that a lot of the work coming out of the planning is really kind of focused on large urban areas. Okay. So the question is what works for, say, a neighborhood in Chicago or a neighborhood in Minneapolis, does that translate to a smaller rural community? That's what we're trying to get a better handle on. Okay. So we invest in good schools, not to feed the labor market, but to be attractive to families with children. Public safety. Do I feel safe walking my dog at midnight? Okay. Parks, recreation, libraries, those little pocket parks that some of those small Iowa communities are doing. Something we're seeing increasingly in Wisconsin is a lot of Wisconsin smaller communities were developed along rivers. Okay. And I think that's also true for Minnesota, for a lot of places. Well, over time, what the communities have done is they've moved up out of the floodplain. Okay. So that space between kind of the downtown and the river um, really it was the back of the buildings. There wasn't much there. What communities are doing now is they're taking that riverfront and they're turning them into park-like areas. They're turning them into bike trails, into walking trails, gathering places, a pier that maybe you can go fishing off of. They're reusing their existing resources to make it a more attractive place for people. Community fairs and festivals, things like art in the parks, farmers markets, music on the square. These types of community events not only bring people to, say, downtown, but it's a quality of life attribute. There's a community that's north of Madison. It's about 20 minutes north, so it's within the commuting shed. And they've been focusing. They've adopted this policy. They've had an old hardware store that has been converted into a small brew pub that specializes in local foods, and they bring in live entertainment. And the community is doing everything that they possibly can to make sure that that business is successful. Okay. Viable business organizations, including professional development opportunities for local businesses. A lot of the things that we see in the second wave and the third wave are bleeding into and still being embraced in this fourth wave. Free public Wi-Fi, active volunteer organizations, early childhood education, increasingly concerns about elder care. This is something that Tessa Conroy and I have been looking at, is the impact of access to childcare on things like labor market outcomes. But what we're finding is that there's a generation, and it falls predominantly on women. They're getting squeezed on both ends, childcare and elder care. Okay, there's a lot of talk about childcare. There's less talk about access to elder care. Okay, creating networking opportunities for small business owners. Okay, again, that dynamic economic cluster, those notions of social capital, that idea is not what you know, it's who you know. There's a network of people within this community that is the backbone of the economy. How do we network them? How do we interact with them? Be open and receptive to newcomers to the community. If the strategy is to try to attract people to move into the community, they're going to come in with new ideas. That's innovation. We want to embrace that. Okay. Be open and receptive to them. How many of you have heard in your community, you don't understand because you're not from here? Okay. That's the kiss of death. Okay. Because if I'm a newcomer to the community and I come in with new ideas and I want to try to do something different, and people just kind of go, oh, well, you're not from here. Um, that's the kiss of death. Now, as an economist, I can study tax incentives, I can study business formation, I can study entrepreneurship patterns. But when it comes to stuff like this, as an economist, I really like, oh man, I'm not sure how to help communities get past this. Okay. The other thing is attitudes around failure. Okay. Entrepreneurship and innovation there will be failure associated with that. And indeed, the learning from those failures is what leads to sustainable growth, sustainable success. What is the community's attitude about failure? Before I came to Wisconsin, I was at the University of Maine, and we were working with a community, Kittery, Maine, which is if you're going up the New Hampshire coast, right as you leave New Hampshire, you go into Maine. That's Kittery. It's a town of about 9,000 people, 10,000 people, and they didn't have a grocery store. So we asked them, why don't you have a grocery store? Well, rather than saying, well, there's a couple of really nice ones right across the bridge in New Hampshire, we go there. Okay, that's not how they respond to the question. They respond and go, oh, Fred's been trying to start a grocery store for years and he keeps failing. Ooh, that just basically sent a signal that failure is unacceptable. What signal does that send to people that are trying to do new things? Okay, and again, as an economist, I'm really on thin ice talking about this stuff, but it's really fundamentally important. It's the attitude of the community. Okay. So do these strategies that flow from the first wave to the second do they replace each other? Do you take all the first wave strategies and throw them out? No. Essentially, what we're doing is that we're expanding the toolbox. We're adding new tools to the toolbox. Okay. Maybe we don't spend our time worrying about recruitment. We don't do that. We focus on entrepreneurs, we focus on the existing businesses here, and we're strategic on the types of businesses that we focus on. Okay. We're focusing on making this an attractive community. All of a sudden, your phone rings, and there's a business that's thinking of moving in and they need help. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. We're ready to help you. Are we going to give away the store to convince you to move here? No. But are we willing to work with you? Yes, we're willing to work with you. Now, this is where incentives get to be a question in terms of if you've got an existing business in your community, say it's 50 employees, and say they want to double in size, they want to go to 100 employees, but they need help. They need the water line improved. They need the road coming into the business improved. They need a stoplight at the interchange. These are investments. Okay. Will the community make those investments? That's being a good partner to the community. Is it an incentive? Not necessarily, but that kind of falls back into that first wave strategy. So again, we're not throwing one out. We're essentially expanding the toolbox and refocusing some of our energies. I'll stop with that and see if there's any questions before Brigid kind of talks about what's happening in Minnesota.
Hi, Steve.
Steve,
We do have a couple of questions. One of the questions was, when does a new business become an existing business? Like, when do they stop creating new jobs and start becoming a net loser of jobs?
Oh, that's a judgment call. That's I would suggest that when a new business starts up, there are generally two periods in time that are kind of benchmarks. Okay. And these are not cast in stone, but if a business should be cash flowing by year 3, okay, they should be generating enough cash flow that they're sustainable. By year 5, they should be profitable. They should not only be cash flowing, they should be turning a bit of a profit. So if a company makes it by year 5, and they are sustainable, that's when I think they would shift from that new business to an existing business. So if you, that year 5, and that kind of comes from research in terms of kind of rules of practice for coming out of the business school. So I'd say year 5. We did find that it varies. We found that comparing business survival rates, Tessa Conroy and I, we found that the business survival rates 5-year is much lower in urban areas than it is in rural areas. Rural businesses tend to survive to year 5 and beyond at a higher rate than urban businesses. Now, initial thought is, oh, that's good, right? Rural businesses survive longer. Well, not necessarily. In an urban area, if you're not cash flowing, there's really high opportunity cost to keeping that business afloat. So if you're in an urban market and that business is not making sense by the time you come up to year 3, it's easier to shut it down and try something else. In a rural area, there may not be those opportunities. So that business that in an urban market may not make sense, in a rural market, you may continue that on. So that 5 years, it depends. In an urban market, it might be less than 5 years. In a rural market, it might be a little bit more than 5 years.
Right, thank you. I think we'll go to Brigid next and come back for more questions later.
Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Steve. There's nothing I like better as an extension person than rolling up to an extension function in my Benz and walking in the wrong door. I find that's how you prove you're not from a community. Is there's oftentimes certain doors that community members know you go in the left door to get to a certain place, and I always walk in the wrong door. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here to talk a little bit about how we've implemented this in Minnesota. So I think it must have been about 2022. I saw Steve do a very similar presentation to this, and I got super excited. I was like, this just makes sense to me as a framework for thinking about how do we do economic development in communities? How do we talk about this in a way? Because I think one of the things that happens in communities is that you have people who are very interested in economic development. They sit on their local economic development authority board, but they don't necessarily have a lot of training either in economics or economic development. And this framework just really struck me as a way to have conversations with community. And so I wanted to share a little bit about how I've used this in Minnesota. So in good extension fashion, I took the work from Steve and adapted it to my kind of way of thinking. Steve kind of hinted at this at the end of his presentation, but I like the wave sort of theory as kind of a way of thinking about how did these approaches come about and understanding the history of this. But when I'm in front of communities, I really talk about them more as 4 different approaches. And the idea here is to really start to help communities think about, which approach might make more sense for them to focus on versus some of the other approaches. And that doesn't mean that they can't work in different spaces, but some communities may do better working in one of these approaches versus another approach. For example, in Minnesota, there are some communities, particularly along the 35 or 169 corridors, that can do industrial recruitment really, really well. You think about Faribault, Owatonna, Shakopee. They can attract a lot of big businesses that are foreign-based companies into Minnesota, and that's great. They should. But if you think about a lot of our little small communities that dot our rural landscape, that just may not be a strategy for them. And so I kind of categorize this into a presentation. One of the communities that we were asked to engage with, the question that they kind of came to us was, well, we hired an economic development professional and he's been here for about a year and we want to evaluate his performance. Can you give us a dashboard of metrics to gauge his performance? And we were like, well, I don't know. And we started asking more questions. And when it came down to it, it turned out that this community just really didn't have a set of shared goals around economic development. And so when they were trying to measure the performance of their economic development professional, since they didn't have any goals, they really had nothing to measure against. So my colleague Jennifer and I went into that community and we were like, okay, we started with this presentation and we started just asking the question, what do you think about when you think about economic development? And one of the people in the room started talking, as Steve kind of hinted to this, started talking about the river that was outside of town and how we should develop that. And there's so many opportunities for outdoor recreation, and this would be great. And another person in the room, kind of more the banker, started talking about, well, we've got this business incubator and we have these different things. How do we get loans to businesses? And then another gentleman in the room talked about the big manufacturers in town and was like, hey, what about how do we, worry about these manufacturers? Nobody knows what's going on, but they employ a lot of our people. And this conversation just kind of kept going around in a circle. And when I presented this to them, kind of the light bulbs went on. They were like, I get it. The river person was talking more about residential recruitment. The banker was talking a little bit more about the grow your own strategy. And the manufacturer was talking a little, or the guy who was worried about manufacturing was a little more in the business retention expansion. So having this as a framework to talk in community about what does economic development look like, where do we want to focus our efforts, has been really, really helpful for a lot of Minnesota communities. So you see in this slide, I have kind of the 4 approaches, and then I have a little bit about where the focus is. So for industrial recruitment, grow your own and cooperation partnership, the focus is more on jobs. And then we look at residential recruitment, then the focus shifts more to community and to attracting people. And so this again helps communities start to think about that. And then I have broken it down, kind of following a lot of what Steve mentioned, kind of into these 4 buckets and kind of looking at a little bit of what does that mean in community, right? So like industrial recruitment's a little more focused on incentives, infrastructure investments. You might be looking more at goods producing companies, manufacturing, foreign direct investment. So we talk about that a little bit with community. On the grow your own piece, we talk a little bit more about business retention expansion. We talk about entrepreneurship. This might bring in workforce as well, like how do we handle some of our workforce issues? So those are kind of some of the things that we bring in when we talk about that grow your own approach. When I talk about cooperation and partnership, again, this is something that some communities do really, really well. You think about Rochester, Destination Mayo, Destination Medical Center. You talk about stuff like that. You talk in my region, kind of southern Minnesota around Mankato, we have Green Seam, which is really focused around kind of synergies in the agricultural sector. So you talk about kind of this approach that might involve more about growing industries. It might be about networks. You might talk about ecosystems, those kinds of things. And then finally, the 4th approach around residential recruitment, which is really more about those quality of life. All of a sudden, you're talking about this term placemaking that Steve mentioned. So all this to say, this is something that I walk through communities in maybe 5 to 10 minutes with them, just kind of explaining these different approaches, getting them thinking about that language piece. And this was the quote, direct quote from our friend at the EDA that invited us into that community. He said, my EDA, this was a question we got at the beginning. My EDA has been challenged with setting a strategic direction and goals for years. All they do is rehash the same old stuff. I've been here for a year. It's sort of like herding cats. I can't get them to move in the same direction. As I mentioned, my colleague, we went in, we presented this kind of 4 approaches. We had a good conversation around like, what do you want to do around economic development? They were able to put language around what they were talking about. And then they were able to have a much deeper conversation and go further into what they wanted to do. And then we did what we call a SOAR activity with them. So we brought them together with community members to talk about their strengths, their opportunities, their aspirations, and their results. And this was the quote that we got back from our economic development friend the day after. He said, I went to the grocery store today. The deli owner, the grocery store owner came up to me, he shook my hand. He said how fantastic last night, which was the SOAR activity, was. He spent 30 minutes outside the meeting. I hope they were in a vestibule because this meeting was in January, talking to other business owners. They're like, we got all these great new ideas. We've got great direction. And what we know from this community following this is that they were able, they've put this together now. Now they're talking more meaningful to each other about what economic development looks like. And they've put in several applications. They've gotten funding from SMIF, our Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation, from some other grant organizations to really start to put some strategic direction to their economic development efforts. So I think, Steve, what you did was amazing and it can really be helpful for communities as they talk about economic development together. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brigid. And thank you so much, Steve, for sharing your work with us. So this is an opportunity to ask questions. Again, we have about 9 minutes, and so we'll try to get through as many of these as we can. And I'm going to just go with start with questions that have the most upvotes. So Steve, you're at the will of what the folks are upvoting. So the question is from Paul, and access to capital is still a significant challenge for many small startup businesses in rural communities. At the same time, a number of the early retirees who have chosen to move to rural communities may have the capital they would be willing to invest in local businesses. Have you seen examples of communities that have done a good job of connecting entrepreneurs to local venture capital?
Yes, there is. They're sometimes referred to as angel investors, and many times it requires a lot of these folks, they want to be involved, but they don't know how to get involved, and they need to be asked. So there needs to be someone within the community or a team of folks within the community that know these people and are actually willing and able to go out and, let's go have coffee. Let's talk about this. Let's have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? It takes, because a lot of times if you're waiting for these, say, retirees that have moved in, they're really not in a position to kind of assume a leadership role. They're new. They're not sure who the key players are. But if they're asked, a lot of times they're really more than willing to step up to the plate. So it takes that kind of ability to ask. Now, how do you find them? Well, it depends on the size of the community. Smaller communities, you kind of know them. But, this is where partnering with real estate agents of essentially saying, who are you seeing moving into the community that we should be talking to? And this is more than simply, hey, a welcome basket. Here you go. Thanks. And you never hear from them again. It's a slow, methodical process. And that's where I think a lot of, this is what places communities separate from, say, the state. Communities are in this for the long haul. They can take small incremental steps that over time can build up to having a big impact. If you're at the state level, you're looking at getting reelected next year. You need something now. You need something splashy now. So the incentives at the state level are very different than the incentives at the local level. And I think that places the local communities in a more sustainable position. But it takes that kind of reaching out, that asking, that nurturing, that kind of building, and that takes time.
Great. And if I know we have, I've seen the participant list or the attendee list, so I know there's lots of wealth of knowledge in the audience. So please feel free to comment and provide feedback as well if you feel so inclined to do so. So another question, this comes from Katrina. What about good jobs? How do we define the labor market in terms of the kind of work that people want to do and the kind of work that will support the life they want, not just jobs, but good jobs?
Brigid, you want to try that one? I know it's a good job. I know it's a bad job, but that's my personal taste. I used to swing a hammer for my brother-in-law. I thought that was a great job. I hate picking up a hammer now. So it varies. I would think one of the things is the benefits package. I saw a shift in communities. This whole idea that, why aren't people moving into our community to take these jobs? Well, they start to ask, well, is anybody going to pick up and move their family for a $15 an hour job with no benefits? No. So this whole notion of what is a good job has evolved over the last 10 years. And I think this notion that a job is a job is a job is changing. But I think Brigid's comment that what works in one community may not be appropriate for another community. That's an extremely important observation. There is no magic bullet. There is no cookie cutter approach that works. Each community is facing a unique set of circumstances. Can they learn from each other? Yes. But what works in one community may not work in another community. And I think Brigid's comment around that is extremely important.
And oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. There's an interesting question here. Do you have any examples of small communities that got better at failing, or maybe some that are good at failing? If so, what helped them become more curious about learning from failure?
There are definitely, in Minnesota, we sometimes kind of joke a little bit about two groups that like to work with us sometimes, which is the progressive in, like not attaching political meaning to that, but just the communities that are sort of always thinking toward the future. And then we sometimes, the desperate, the communities that are really struggling and need help. I think in that kind of progressive or communities that are always thinking about the future, that is part of what they're thinking about, right? And they're comfortable, I think, at a community level having that conversation where, as Steve mentioned, there isn't this feeling of, oh, we screwed, that the community isn't going to necessarily get really upset or mad at people if things don't work. For example, we're trying out a new thing in the community that I live in, and it didn't work out quite as well as we thought. We got some really good feedback. We learned a lot through the process, but it didn't quite turn out the way we thought. And so, we're sitting there like, are the taxpayers going to be really upset with us about this? Blah, blah, you kind of think about that negative narrative that can get going. So I think communities that have an equal response of positive narrative, right? Like, yeah, that didn't work out, but we still think that this was a good idea. I don't know, Steve, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah. It's if you're not familiar with the Iowa Small Town Project out of Iowa State University, Ames, Iowa, if you're not familiar with that, look that up, because they've been studying small rural Iowa towns, 5,000 to 10,000 people, and they have accumulated a number of case studies. And they're the ones that essentially it's talking with David Parker, who kind of runs that program now, that I got the, well, if you're not from here, so you don't understand. That's the kiss of death. I got that from his work. So they've got a wealth of information. It's the Iowa Small Town Project at Iowa State University. Just a wealth of information. And they really kind of get more into the weeds in terms of like the attitude of the community. And as an economist, I don't feel as comfortable talking about that. My wife teaches sociology, and she'll hear me on some of these when I work from home, and I'll start talking about culture, and she'll always say, "You're talking about culture wrong." So I'm going to defer to the sociologists that really know this stuff better than I do.
Wonderful. And we still have good questions, and Steve, I'll follow up with you. And if there are ones that we want to promote to the website, I might ask you for some feedback on that, and you
Sure.
as well, Brigid. So I just want to thank Steve and Brigid for taking the time out of their day, and thank all of you who joined us to attend this webinar. If you're interested in future webinars, we do have another one that will be coming up on August 26th. You can get the Zoom link registration, and this will be related to rural housing and the economic impact of rural housing. Again, there will be more information coming. But with that, I just want to say thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.